What's going on, gamers? This is Valkyrie Hunter, and today we finally finished up our playthrough of Callisto Protocol. After finishing what seemed like a pretty lengthy story mode for this game, come to a few different conclusions on how I would rate and review this adventure. But if you are curious as to certain points that I'll be making throughout the video, I have my full first playthrough uploaded to the channel so you can reference my main source and really see where I am coming from. As a spoiler warning though, we are going to be diving into all the major aspects of Callisto Protocol, including things like the story, music, gameplay, replayability, art style, overall tone and mood, and the icky bugs I had when playing. Keep in mind that did play on the PC port for this review, which plays a decent part into my thoughts on the overall polish of the product, and my playthrough also extends over a decent period of time, regretfully, so sorry about that, but that includes one major patch of the game during my initial run. I did start this on launch, and then, yeah, just finished it like 2 weeks ago, so there's your kind of time window. So that does include one major patch of the game, so I'll take that into consideration later on. And finally, I will attempt to be as objective as possible in order to give this game a fair shot and not have outside opinions and biases corrupt my views on the end result. So with that in mind, let's start with the story. Callisto Protocol is a strange sort of spiritual successor to the popular sci-fi horror trilogy Dead Space. The original talk and hype for this game that I read about really put this game on a high pedestal. This is due to Glenn Schofield, who was the original developer for the concept and eventual creation of Dead Space, being the main point for discussion in most discussions about this upcoming new IP. Dead Space is itself a great horror game due to its atmosphere and focus on immersing the player into their grim surroundings, and Schofield wanted to do the same thing, but apparently without restrictions from parent company EA. I mean, that's what I read up when I looked up online, but essentially that created Callisto Protocol. Now that Glenn Schofield and his team were unbound from the shackles of EA and their corporate decision making, how does this hold up to his previous iteration of a cosmic horror in the final frontier? Well, the short answer, it's simply just not as good. But here's a long answer. So, starting off with the main man, Jacob, his story isn't really interesting until the second half of the game. What I'm specifically referring to here is like the cargo sections with Danny. I mean, it's a decent little twist to have the cargo be hidden vials of the alien life form, but really, upon further inspection, how do we not see a problem with the method of cargo? Like, supposedly the boxes are filled with medical supplies, which Jacob does show off to Danny in a cutscene, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, these are just medical supplies and bandages and stuff. But if that's the case, then why are they all stored in crates marked with like nuclear slash toxic symbols? Like, I didn't really notice this when I was first playing it, but now kind of relooking back, it's like they're nuclear toxic symbols or like radiation. This game doesn't make it clear if irradiated medical equipment is the norm in this universe, which I'm going to assume that as a player that it is not. So how does this not really set up a red flag for our trucker duo before even the game starts? Obviously, we don't see them actually loading up the crates into their ship, but I think it'd be a little concerned with handling radiation-covered cargo that is meant to be used as medical equipment. But I digress. I mean, Jacob himself is a fine character to have as the main guy, but at times his dialogue can be very obvious and blatant about his surroundings and recent events. Developers, I feel like, should have taken a more show don't tell method of storytelling because the current telling method has Jacob sounding like a complete doofus at times. Elias, on the other hand, is a pretty good character who brings in a slight bit of moral gray into the story, but it only gets ripped away later down the line. His conversation with Jacob over helping, like, a murderer out of prison is a very intriguing subject that I wish the game kind of pursued more, giving the player a choice akin to something like Resident Evil 7, maybe, with the antidote vial could have been a great method to encourage replayability and give numerous choices, as well as give Elias some more power as a character. But what we get at the end of the day is just a funny English guy who says bruv all the time, who helps our protagonist until he's no longer needed because he dies and is replaced with Danny. Oh, Danny. This character doesn't make a lot of sense to me at all. Very little sense. Even after having the full context of the story in mind here, her actions seem very flippant and just don't make a lot of sense. The very start of the game is, in my opinion, her biggest downfall because she puts herself and the lives of the people under her command at risk because she has a hate boner for Jacob. I mean, but seriously, if she thinks that the ship is carrying some sort of dangerous cargo, which was the contributing factor for the terrorist attack on Europa, why would we risk damaging the ship or the cargo? I feel like this is bad for two different reasons. One, the crashing of the ship could lead to the pathogen spreading to Callisto and its inhabitants, and it would no longer give her and her squad the ability to question Jacob on what he's carrying and get to the bottom of what they think is the cause for the fall of Europa. It's like if we're trying to figure out what's going on with Europa and figure out why all these people died, and specifically her younger sister, which is revealed later, is the one who gets killed and kind of gives her like an emotional background as to go after this guy. It's like, how are we supposed to figure out what happened if we just take out a random truck driver? That'd be like, imagine if like some guy who is a truck driver somehow, just bear with me here, somehow has a shipment of like, I don't know, like vaccines for something, but it's hidden under the guise that they're vaccines, but they're actually like, I don't know, like chemical bombs or nuclear weapons or something. Why would we want to blow up the truck instead of stopping the vehicle and questioning and torturing the people and trying to figure out what's going on? I don't know. That's just me. Some people, I guess the point is that she's kind of like emotionally compromised, maybe, but we'll get to more of that here in a sec. So later on, when she's shown what Jacob thinks he's carrying, because we get the twist later that it's actually like vials of this old ancient alien life form hidden under medical stuff. She's understandably in disbelief. Like even with the proof that the cargo is not what she thinks it is, she still acts like an asshole to Jacob for very little reason. Because if you think about it, her main grievance against him is that he was like a courier for these people to do these inexplicable things and kill her sister and blah blah blah. But it's like he dispels that thought process. I mean, falsely, of course, but like he still dispels the thought process like, oh well, this is just medical supplies, I'm just doing a job to make money. And she like is still kind of an asshole to him and still doesn't trust him. I mean, like, it's okay that she doesn't trust Jacob or anything going on in Black Iron Prison, but like before the ship came down, we didn't know what was happening. We just knew that it was one of the moons of Jupiter. And we didn't know that this is the whole like crux of the terrorist attack was like this place and this alien life form on this moon. But it's like then she turns around like soon after this, if I'm getting my timing right here. She turns around soon after this and just hands him a weapon after he helped fend off different groups of like the infected people. Like she hands off a gun to a guy that she just had disdain for since the very beginning. And now all of a sudden she just cares about what happens to Jacob, even though she still acts like he's part of the cause for all of this. Like it, I don't know. Even just like playing through this, I was still kind of like confused as to her. Okay, not confused with the motivations, but like confused as to how her motivations play a part in her current emotions, because her current emotions and her motivations definitely didn't line up in a couple points in all of this. But I don't know. It even gets worse later on because it's like now all of a sudden she cares about him, and it's then revealed later on to her, but first to Jacob, that he even unknowingly was part of the whole thing. It's like at the very end of the story, Jacob figures out that he was an accomplice to this experiment just by transporting these alien life forms, and then lets Danny know about it before he sacrifices himself to let her escape the like now exploding, imploding, filled with zombies prison. She then is just confused and screaming for Jacob, like we didn't just hate his guts a couple hours ago. And all this emotion and mood changing occurs mainly only in the second half. If she had more screen time throughout the entire game instead of just the second half, it would make a little bit more sense. But it really just feels like it gets crammed into the later half of the story and feels more compact and squished because of that. And the final cutscene of the game also really creates a cliffhanger ending with her, and essentially what I assume to be like, oh, she's going to be informing like the star system and the solar system of what the villains are doing with this foreign but deadly life form. Eh, But it's like she just never really was a likable character or a character that was very logical in her approach. I mean, like, okay, I get it. Now, every character needs to be logical and to make the right decision, but it's like they just don't really seem to make sense in with context of the story and what's currently going on in the narrative. So it's like it just Yeah, like I said, she was just never really a likable character. So if there somehow was a sequel for this game, which I'm assuming there isn't going to be because of the poor reception on launch, she would. I just feel like she would still at least be playing a big part in that narrative, which does not sound very appealing, just from her as a character. And in order to make that appealing, they'd have to do okay, not like a 180, but like they would have to revamp how her character feels like in order to make her a higher quality character for the sequel, which then is just like disingenuous to what her character is. So it seems like it's a bit of a lose lose, but I don't know. It just her character to me is just kind of like a mess, a narrative mess. So, but whatever. The cliffhanger itself also provides Jacob with like a potential way out of a very seemingly impossible situation, which I feel bad for the future writers for if they did make a sequel because it puts them in a very poor spot to make a reasonable connection from this game to the sequel. But I mean, anyway, so a lot of the story beats themselves, just overall of the story, really kind of fall into predictable pitfalls of like the horror genre. I mean, when thinking about how I feel about the villains themselves, they fail in my mind to really stand out from other bad guys of other media. Like this is essentially a variation, if you think about it, of the plot to the Alien movie. So you have some sort of larger entity, in this case the Black Iron Prison and the Warden and whoever he's associated with, who discovers an alien life form, which technically was in the colony before the prison, and the prison was just built on top of the colony, but whatever, not super important. Large energy discovers a human life form, or like alien life form that takes human life and uses their physical body in order to create a menacing creature that is the next evolution of humanity or next evolution of military tech. At least the necromorphs of Alien are a bit more interesting instead of just adding mucus and large pustules to a human and making them want to brawl. And if these infected people are just bashing and beating non infected people, then why are the heads gone and a ton of corpses in game? Because it's just like, it's kind of just like they turn these people into very violent, like ugly monsters, and most of them just partake in like fist to fist, like melee combat. So it doesn't really seem like that there's even much of a purpose. Like I'm thinking of also the scene where they have like the first infected guy and he's like a big cadaver and he's cut up and like strewn open and stuff. And like it's a cool visual, sure, but it's like in terms of really what they're wanting to do, really it just boils down to this is the evolution of man. But it's like okay, being like being a mucus filled like freakazoid is the next evolution of man. Like all these beings are capable of violence, so like their motivation really doesn't make a lot of sense, but they also don't really go in the direction of military tech like the movie Alien does, with trying to like capture and corral these things and turn them into like I don't know, freak boots on the ground. I don't know, like just some like essentially some alien attack dog, I guess. But it's like the game itself doesn't even mention or go in that direction either. So then it's like, what's the point? Because there's no, I mean, I guess they're like, geez, from a gameplay perspective, they're like super resilient, but it's like, that's kind of it. Most of the variations are just like, people covered in pimples that just want to beat you and they growl and they beat people up. It's like they don't eat them, but then for some reason, people's heads are gone. Like I thought we were maybe going to get an explanation for that, but the explanation is that all these people are infected by an ancient alien and turn violent and ugly. that's that's about it. But I mean, if you think about it, I mean, this is kind of one thing that I wish I kind of stuck with, but I mean, there's a reason why I didn't. The main story itself is supplemented with like these audio logs that can be found all over the place that are supposed to tell a more like insider story as to the going ons of like Black Iron Prison and the colony by extension. But the audio logs are like some of the worst audio logs I have seen in a video game. Granted, I have not seen all of the audio logs. It just got to a point where I just kind of stopped caring for the audio logs because there was like literally no substance. There'd just be like generic scared person who did something awful, or generic scared person who screamed and then gets killed while recording. And like the cause for infection isn't hidden in the audio logs, and neither is the purpose of the prison and the goal of the warden and his cronies. So the logs just seem like a feeble attempt to add like a collectible in a game that already missed the mark to really make it truly special. Like they provide no extra context that the main story already does. At least no extra context that is substantial or interesting. Like there's literally I remember an audio log that's like maybe a sentence or like two sentences long and then it ends. It's like less than 10 seconds of material that's a collectible and that's it. I'm like that's that just seems like a very like okay, well, we need to have some sort of collectible, so let's just throw this one in. I mean, like there was the section for like there was that weird little like secret conference room and stuff, which kind of alludes to some things, but it's like even then, it's not something that the main story doesn't already cover with the warden and the guy who becomes the final boss. So I don't know. Story itself, pretty mediocre, pretty predictable, and it's nothing that you haven't seen before if you're into horror or into sci-fi or into sci-fi horror. So, but let's move on to the gameplay. The gameplay itself was the main draw for me to keep on track to finish this game, and it still fell a hair short. Melee, whether the player likes it or not, is king in this adventure due to the lack of flavor and punch to the laser arms, firearms, you know what I mean, like the guns. The gameplay is a very obvious loop of entering a room, handful of baddies are there slash appear, you beat the shit out of them while sidestepping attacks, and then rinse and repeat. Since this is a survival horror game, the resources available to you, of course, will be limited in their access. Couple that with a lack of punch, variety, and honestly, general usefulness of the guns puts the melee on a pedestal which is not very high, but it's just high on comparison. Especially when the game decides to put you in a battle room or like, a room with like a ton of enemies. One of the main talking points from others who have played and or beat the game is the clunkiness of multiple enemies attacking you at once, which now after playing the game really holds true. I really do understand where these people are coming from. Since there's a very limited variety of enemies as well, most of them will run up to you and try to like beat you or like bite you, claw at you, whatever, and which causes them to bundle up and like surround you or just kind of pile up in a spot and it's hard to attack really one at a time to kill one. The auto targeting for the melee actually wasn't really the main culprit for the clunkiness here, in my opinion. It's the camera. Simply not being able to do a quick turn, even with mouse and keyboard controls and juggle enemies around you, is a huge hindrance from being able to survive a 2-on-1 encounter, let alone 4, 5, 6 plus enemies, like in the same room as once. However, the Force Glove is an interesting item. On one hand, no pun intended, it's a very helpful tool to weed out the strong enemy types during a group encounter by using stage hazards nearby, like the big random blenders or walls of nails or that kind of stuff, like the stage hazards. However, it's a super quick method to get rid of any regular enemy. So at the same time, it helps with group situations and like it helps with group situations to be able to pick out the stronger enemies, like I said, or it just trivializes the combat because you just pick somebody up, you throw them into a stage spike, they immediately die, and that's it. So it just really trivializes the combat. I mean, it is balanced with a charge, so you require like a replacement battery or you got to upgrade it to get a decent charge time to use again. But when that glove is fully charged on like the default stats, it can really just be a nope button for anything that isn't a boss. And speaking of the bosses, the two head guys and the final boss are the only bosses to really speak on. Even though there are like 5 or 6 encounters in the game, most of them are two head, who acts the same exact way in every encounter. And if you happen to not have enough ammo in your guns to trigger the stun for the melee combo to like split two head apart to actually really do damage, well, then I guess you're just screwed. Unless I am a complete idiot, which really isn't out of the question here. There is no way to do damage to him outside of projectile weapons or your firearms. So while melee is king for the regular freaks, the guns are then artificially given high importance in the second half, which pushes players to keep on with the sort of meta of melee 90% of the time, and hopefully keep enough ammo on hand to deal with two head like 4 times and the final boss. And now we're going to have to talk about the bugs and the optimization, though. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it took me a few months before I finished this game for the channel, but the first few sessions of playing had huge stuttering and frame drops. There's this one section that I will put on screen here. Excuse me. Well, my frames dropped below like 1 per second while the game itself was still able to run perfectly fine in the background. Like I can remember like hearing the monsters and they're like hitting me and there's like stuff happening, but it's like I just can't react to it because it's literally the slowest slideshow you've ever seen. Like I have no idea how stuff like this can even occur, but like I do have a decent PC setup that can run games like Tarkov, for example, so I don't believe it was a problem on my end. That was the only game breaking problem for me before the optimization patch, which, if I remember, was actually pretty quick after launch. I think like only like 3 or 4 days. But however, even after the patch, I had a couple of crashes and frame drops later on in my playthrough, which were annoying for sure. To give some credit, though, after having a problem like that, the game did do a good job of quick saving before or after events. So I was never far from where I left off before the crash. I do hate that modern gaming is kind of turning more towards pushing products, even if a lot of polishing content is cut from release. But this game, in my mind, doesn't really fall into that category, at least not quite. It still is frustrating to be playing a single player game offline and still be having some of these performance issues. But, like, thankfully, it's not as bad as other releases as of late, for sure. It just falls short in other aspects. And another nitpick that it did have is the audio logs again. I'm sorry if I can rant about the audio logs one more time. The menu for filtering which logs go to which person is confusing and hard to find which logs are new if you don't immediately listen to them. Some of these logs aren't even like logs, but just like an ID tag for progression. So for the average player like myself, it's kind of difficult to tell at times if what you're grabbing is just a key or an optional log. And then if you were to grab a log and try to look for it later, it's like, where the hell is it? It's like you have to remember some random guy's name and then go searching through the menus to try and find it. So, granted, this doesn't happen on every occasion, but it is a nitpick of at least the UI and just how they handle logbooks and collectibles that I feel like should be addressed and fixed if they do end up creating a sequel. But like I said, less than likely. But essentially, a lack of variety is the substantial nail into the quality of the gameplay. Guns feel very samey. Most enemies having very similar attack patterns. Mini bosses getting reshuffled numerous times make this lengthy story feel even longer and drag on pretty early in the playthrough. I mean, it's partially my fault. I did take a bit of a break from YouTube for a little bit, so my fault how this kind of feels like a lot. It is 15 parts that are half an hour each or so. But the gameplay is fun for like the first few hours. It's just with introductions to new mechanics and enemy types being spread far apart and already very limited to begin with, it leads this game to feeling a bit stale with or without the abuse of the Force Gauntlet or the dodge mechanics, which it's like if I was just better at the game, like you could easily do this without getting hurt at all. It's like it's that simple. I'm just kind of an idiot and can be uncoordinated at times or get flustered. So the game does get me sometimes, but it's just that weird give and take. It's like, okay, well, do I abuse the mechanics of the game and just make this game a cakewalk while it's still being stale because I'm using like the same two things to be able to get through this, or do I try and use everything else and then get screwed later when I hit the bosses because then I don't have enough ammo to trigger things for the boss? So it just seems like it's a lose lose either way for the gameplay. But let's go ahead and talk about the art style. Overall, I think this realistic approach works, but it does come off as almost cartoony at times, in my opinion. I understand that the grotesque monsters throughout this moon of Jupiter are supposed to invoke like a primal fear in the player due to the gore being on display on the character models and around the environments, but the combat honestly is what changes that for me. Either when throwing the infected into a randomly like OSHA not approved blenders and spikes, they just turn into like a cartoony like mist of blood. For a game that really like again, I'm going to be going on to the like the marketing for this and the hype before this, so just bear with me here, but like for a game that kind of prides itself on having detailed gore throughout, it misses the mark for me when it comes to these environmental hazards that are placed for the benefit of the player. Don't get me wrong, the dismemberment for the melee and ranged attacks can be satisfying, as well as the many like original death animations for Jacob. But the longer you play and die, as you can see in my playthrough for this game, there really aren't that many variations to the gore. Arms of the monsters only ever really get blown off, even when you're slamming them with a high tech police baton laser taser thingy. I think it would have been that much better and received more praise from me if there was the ability to like break bones and not have them just immediately launched off like they were just made of Legos. I understand that that would potentially come with its own host of problems, and I'm by no means an expert on the limitations of game design, but just from the gore perspective and trying to be individual, like having that individuality and uniqueness in the game, just seeing limbs get broken could be a slightly different way to add some variety without having to really think outside of the box. Like, have you ever seen athletes break legs or other bones during sporting events? Like, I can recall seeing this viral video from a while back at one of the recent Olympics of this French gymnast landing incorrectly and completely snapping his lower leg. Like, that is gruesome without having to have a metric shit ton of misty blood to be everywhere. And outside of the gore, everything is understandably in a cold metal sci-fi setting, which doesn't leave much room for individuality. I mean, sure, there's only so much you can do in a game like this, but like I mentioned earlier, this game doesn't shy away from the stereotypical and the predictable. I mean, it's a little bit different by having it be on the moon of Jupiter called Callisto, because I mean, it has like a very cold and snowy environment, but like it's just it's really just the prison, which is sci-fi, cold metal. It's outside, which is just winter and snow, with bits of like old other buildings and sci-fi and metal. And then there's the old colony later on, which is underground sci-fi metal. Like, there's not really much of a difference besides the chapter names of like, where the hell am I? The only real difference is that like later on in the game, when you're out of the prison, there's more rocks and rocky sort of tones and earth and snow. But that's just kind of it. You know what I mean? Like, it still has its middle corridors. It still has some things. I mean, like, there's also the environments of the aliens that like really change the environment of like the metal and everything. But it's, I mean, that doesn't really get explained, and it just is like a pile of mucus and like doesn't really look very good in terms of the graphics. Like, I mean, it's not supposed to look good. Like, I understand that, but like just the quality of the graphics of those environments that are like being changed and rearranged by this alien just never really popped up very good on my system. I don't know if it was my system sort of a thing or if it was just a game thing, but at the end of the day, it just didn't really look as good as it could have been. But it did have those sections of like, oh, well, the environment is being rearranged, which is kind of taken out of Dead Space's playbook. So it's not entirely original, but I guess it is something different. So again, credit where credit is due. But there just isn't really a lot of those. It's mostly metal, so nothing too much to write home about. But let's have a mentioning of the music. The music was okay, I guess. I mean, there isn't really a memorable track in this entire game, with a few minor exceptions. The menu theme, solely because it's playing upon the startup of the game. It has like that blah sort of like aspect to it, like dramatic blah. The music box, which provides like a psychologically diegetic piece for like maybe 30 seconds at the start, and then like randomly towards the end too, when Jacob's having like some weird like hallucination flashback kind of a thing. And then the music during the credits, solely because I got a copyright claim on my finale episode due to not skipping the credits in a timely manner. I guess for some reason that is a named song that they actually care about, and I mean, it's not like a huge deal, but like it still kind of came as a surprise that I couldn't even play like 2 seconds of a song in the credits, but all the other parts of the game were completely fine for their theoretically original music. So again, not a big deal, but it's just like the music comes off as not, or at least memorable for the wrong reasons, if just not memorable at all, and just generic pieces that do what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to assist the visuals in creating like a fearful and dread-inducing sort of tone and mood for the game by adding another sense into the mix. Instead of just looking at something, and obviously we can't smell what's happening in a game, and be able to smell decomposing bodies would be something else for a video game, but it's like, the only two senses that you're really appealing to in a game like this would be sight and sound. And so this just kind of feels like a check in the box for, okay, we got the scary, suspenseful music, and it's there to help with the visuals and the creepy theme. And that's kind of it. So at the end of it all, kind of just disappointed, really. It really sucks because have to admit, I was on the hype train when this game was being advertised as a spiritual successor. I can't talk to Dead Space since I played 1 and 2 a while back and completely loved them. Great game, super fun to play. Callisto Protocol is not a terrible game by any means. Just when put into context with all of the other problems that I've mentioned, it could have been much more. There is a meta that's focused around melee, using the Force Glove to conserve ammo for the lackluster guns, which then suddenly become important for the repetitive boss fights. That, coupled with a mostly predictable story and mediocre performance, even with a patch, creates a final product that was not worth $60, let alone 70 for those who are playing this on PS5. So, if this game gets like a price reduction to like around 30, I would say that makes it more worthwhile. But for being a spiritual successor to Dead Space, you might as well just put your money towards the remake that came out recently for Dead Space. Like that's just overall a better game. It adds more content. It's more suspenseful. There's more. It's just more of everything. And this game is just kind of like a not as good carbon copy of Dead Space that was just overhyped. So it was fun while it lasted, but it's just like a what could have been scenario. You know what I mean? So, but as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know your thoughts and opinions, regardless on if you only watched me play or if you played closer yourself. I do love some good conversation and discourse, so go ahead and drop a comment on the video. And I am trying to grow my channel as well, so if you like what I do, please consider maybe hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel with notifications. I try to post a video every week, but I mean, realistically, it's approximately about every 2 weeks because I still work a day job. This is my actual job. But again, thank you so much for sticking it through to the end. Next up on the menu is finishing up my playthrough of Metroid Prime support on Metroid Prime Trilogy for the Wii. So I hope to see you guys there. Thank you guys for watching.